The euro area crisis was not just about debt, but it nearly tore the polity apart. There is no doubt it was an existential crisis. I have Waltraud Schelkle from the 𝘰𝘬𝘯𝘀 with me to revisit some of the key turning points of this crisis. Hi, Waltraud. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
As I said, it was a huge challenge for the European polity as a whole. But was it also such a bitter and entrenched conflict between the northern and the southern member states, as some of the livid newspaper covers from the area would suggest to us?
Well, yes and no. Yes, because it was reported as a big fight between the south and the north, and that becomes a political reality. Even some of our colleagues who study these things like us take sometimes the narrative in the media as if the other side had said this. And yes, there were some bitter feelings. We probably come to that. But no, because a colleague of ours, 𝘵𝘦𝘴𝘵𝘪𝘀𝘍𝑔𝘁 and I have just published a paper in New Political Economy in which we show that actually in all these reforms, and during the euro area crisis there were 10 packages with almost 50 reforms, there was no stable north versus south. The southern countries were mostly in one stable solidarity coalition, but they were joined by Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and sometimes Ireland. Germany was contrary to this idea that they were always part of the frugal four, never part of a stable coalition. They were pretty much in the middle of solidarity versus responsibility or sovereignty, as we coded this. So in that sense, there was no stable coalition. A northern bloc did not exist as such. It was split in different groups. And then the only thing that you really can say is a very stable pattern was that Eastern European countries and Southern European countries practically never joined. The two exceptions is Slovenia, that sometimes joined the Southern European ones. Well, they are fast almost Southern Europe. And Malta did not always join the Southern European coalition.
You mentioned this piece of research of you, and it's big on solidarity, but I also know you do research on reinsurance. What is the quintessential difference between these two, and which one was more relevant or more feasible in the context of the euro area crisis?
I mean, in a way, solidarity and reinsurance is like the general concept, solidarity, a form of mutual support, and reinsurance that is a realization of solidarity. And I came to study particular solidarity because with all this reporting about the euro area crisis, you were wondering how did they actually pull through? If it was so negative, if the feuds were so bitter, as you asked earlier. And so I looked at how actually the thing held together. And one thing was that, for example, monetary policy that rescues banks also rescues countries. That a cross-border payment system can not only be used to operate payments across borders, but also in a situation of sudden stop of capital, it can help countries' economies to process payments continuously. Or think of free movement. I mean, when youth unemployment rates in Italy and especially Spain shot up to 40%, they could move. Even though unemployment was high everywhere, but you could not say, well, a young Spaniard or a young Italian cannot move. So there were mechanisms of mutual support that were almost the byproduct of something else. Now, over time, countries noted, especially when you have such enormous crisis, is that you have to create something that helps countries in these catastrophic events. And repeatedly the member states could agree on that instead of just solidarity by stealth, hopefully finding some institution like any European Central Bank or free movement. They created bespoke mechanisms of helping countries when they were overwhelmed. So only for these extreme risks. And that is, for example, monetary policy when a systemic banking crisis happens so that the economy can still proceed. That is, of course, the notorious Troika programs that are not seen as solidarity by anybody. But frankly, if you are a Latin American country and see what support European countries got during that time, I mean, much higher volumes of credit and for much longer maturities, you would be envious of that. And actually, the Brazilian governor of the IMF has said so. So in that sense, there was solidarity also because it was a risk exposure for those who guaranteed these programs. So all member states who didn't have a program, which included, by the way, Italy, because Italy had never a program and was a guarantor just like Germany or France or any other country was. And in that sense, there was solidarity because he also didn't know, will these risks that the country fails and cannot pay back materialize?
It's really fascinating because there is some of these, as you said, humiliating or bitter moments as perceived by some of the member states. But there is also some more inspiring moments and uplifting us. For me, who mostly works with large data sets, it's somewhat fascinating or astonishing how a single speech act can make a difference. What was the significance, or why was Draghi's speech so important in this crisis? And did we had anything similar turning point in other later crises?
So Draghi's speech was important, not only because he calmed down markets by this open-ended promise to not let the euro fail. So you could be invested in euros, euro bonds, euro stocks, euro whatever, and he promised you he would not let the euro fail. But it also was so important because it was part of a grand bargain, namely in return for making such an open-ended promise, which creates, banks can become more risk-loving when they know there will always, the euro will be saved. It was also part of a big bargain to create a banking union. And for that, you had to get Germany accept. They had long resisted a banking union because they felt it gets ever further and then we have to stand in for failing banks somewhere in Southern Europe, even though they had enough failing banks of their own. And the UK. The UK was, of course, not interested in having a banking union for euro area countries. They themselves didn't want to join it because they would never accept the European institution to do the banking supervision of their banks. And so these two countries really had to accept that this would happen. And they did. And in that sense, it is a big breakthrough, and the banking union has really proven its worth later on, especially with the COVID pandemic.
It's good that you mentioned what happened later on, because I would be particularly curious of whether there was any lesson learning in the context of this crisis. Like, what did the EU learn upon witnessing and enduring the euro area crisis? And was this lesson learning challenged later by any other actors?
I mean, your questions almost indicate why I'm always a bit skeptical that one can talk about learning in such a complex, multi-level political system as the EU. There's always somebody who learns very different lessons from the same event. There's somewhere learning, but not in other parts because other considerations take precedence, like political opposition at home, where the best lesson cannot be implemented and must not even be spoken about, etc. But of course, in a way, through trial and error, what works? For example, to give a promise like Draghi did in its, we will do whatever it takes to save the euro, and I tell you it will be enough. That's a reinsurance promise. If the thing really fails, I will come in big time with my instrument that he promised and never actually used. So with such reinsurance promises, the tail risks of crisis we will take off. The member states have learned that this is something actually that adds to their national capacities. And they have created that over and over again in a bespoke manner, in a temporary manner, because the threshold to create a central budget is, of course, a huge one and cannot be decided in a crisis moment. It would create a question of how do we democratically control a central budget? Yes, there's a European Parliament, but we know it's not elected as a normal national parliament, and the national parliaments would lose a big role that so far sustains them. And so I do not see that coming soon, but they have learned in a way that these kind of schemes where we all pool our resources and help each other from becoming overwhelmed, that this is something to have, and it has evolved from these lessons.
And you, what do you think? Did the EU handle the crisis well, or did it only push problems into the future? Be sure to check our website, where you can find all solid papers published in open access and also discuss these topics in our Blue Sky account. Thank you.